How's the volume in the back? Sound okay? Okay, great. I want to start by thanking Professor Hansen, Mary, Dr. Mike, Gang, Hannah Abigail, the Center for Southeast Asian Studies, and all of you for inviting me today, and thanks so much for coming out at the end of a long, hectic semester on a beautiful Friday afternoon. My story that I want to tell today ends in the Ayutthayan Kingdom, in what's now Thailand, but it doesn't begin there. It begins in the Kandyan Kingdom in what's now central Sri Lanka, whose greatest extent in the middle of the 18th century looked rather like that. It begins in 1729 with the death of a Buddhist monk whose name was Hulangamue Jinadasa Thero in Kandy. And thus, there was a third complete decline in the number of fully ordained Buddhist monks, bhikkhus, on the island by whom new ordinations could be conducted. And so ambitious novice monks and anxious kings, especially the foreign-born king Kīrti Śrī Rājasiṃha, about whose failed assassination attempt you'll soon hear that Anne mentioned, each hoping to restore the defunct monastic ordination lineage, tried contacting or wanted to contact Buddhist sanghas in Bago and Arakan, as previous Lankan monarchs had done, but had no choice but to work through the agents and merchants of the Dutch East India Company. What I'll refer to from here on out for the most part is the VOC, the Verenigde Oost-Indische Company. The VOC exercised control over most of the island's coastal littoral and enjoyed a treaty-backed blockade of its most important ports, Jaffna, Puttalam, Negombo, Colombo, basically most of those cities. The VOC directed the Kandyan courtiers, monks, and kings not to Burma, but to Siam, where the VOC had hoped to utilize Kandy's desire for foreign Buddhist diplomacy as a bargaining chip to improve their economic and political relations there. More broadly speaking, in Sri Lanka throughout this period, the VOC often capitulated to the demands and the anxieties of the Kandyan Kingdom's political and religious elites in hope of retaining and growing access to the fertile cinnamon cultivation lands, tenuously shared between the kingdom and the company on the southwestern coast. And so the best cinnamon in the world grows along this stretch right here. In the 1740s and in the 1750s, this capitulation took the form of the VOC searching for and delivering Ayutthayan Buddhist monks to the island. They eventually arrived in 1753, in 1756, and finally in 1759. The company, in other words, represented itself to the still independent Kandyan Kingdom, the still independent but landlocked Kandyan Kingdom, bereft of access to the island's ports, as emissaries of its interests abroad, including in the search for Buddhist monks in Ayutthaya. This is to say that the extraordinary fact of the Dutch East India Company mediating Buddhist monastic connectivity on behalf of Kandy had as much to do with what was going on in Kandy as it did with what was going on in Ayutthaya. What was going on in Ayutthaya was a starkly different situation vis-a-vis the company. Here, the VOC was one of numerous trading interests: Portuguese, French, English, Malay, Indian, Arabian, Chinese, and more, who were perennially jockeying for the favor of the reclusive Ayutthayan kings and courts. Oftentimes, the Dutch could only buy those commodities prized on a variety of inter-Asian markets from the king's own storehouses at fixed prices, and sometimes at a financial loss. So there is a very different balance of power in play here. The cosmopolitan and urban Ayutthayan court functionally beat the company at its own economic game, trying to establish monopolies and fix prices. So local Dutch agents hoped to show a new face to the Siamese court in the middle of the 18th century as an innovative experiment, as brokers of Buddhist diplomacy, as emissaries of Kandy's desire for foreign monks. What could go wrong? Yet, In spite of these diplomatic overtures across the Bay of Bengal, war soon broke out in the 1760s, both in Kandy and in Ayutthaya. In Kandy, a catalog of disputes and grievances between the kingdom and the VOC escalated into an open rebellion by coastal Sinhalese laborers, who were soon aided by Kandyan military reinforcements. The rebellion boiled over into a full-scale confrontation in the early months of 1761, a war that lasted until 1766, when the Kandyan king officially signed a new treaty with the VOC, officially ceding the coastal cinnamon cultivation lands to the company, a major win it had desired for over a century. Meanwhile, in Ayutthaya, the center of Siamese political and economic power, the forces of Burmese Konbuang emperors bore down on the city and its provinces in 1760 and again in 1764, leading to the sudden overthrow of the city and kingdom 3 years later. Everywhere, the possibility of violence and regime change was in the air. For the Dutch VOC, as its global economic outlook continued to decline throughout the 18th century, as its relations with Ayutthaya and Kandy both were at a nadir, sought to exploit this violence, unsurprisingly, for its own gain. At the center, then, of these violent diplomatic devolutions were two rather peculiar and peripatetic, which is my favorite word I ever learned from Professor McCoy. You can blame him for some of that. Two peculiar and peripatetic figures with changing loyalties. And as my Sinhala and Thai and Dutch language archives seem to suggest, intense personal ambition and charisma. The first was Krom Muen Thep Phiphit, the son of Ayutthaya's recently deceased King Boromakor by a lesser consort. And while Thep Phiphit was not a contender for the Siamese throne, he backed one of his elder half-brothers, Uthompon's short-lived bids for the crown amidst a violent succession dispute in 1758 and 59. Thep Phiphit was subsequently forced by his other elder half-brother, the new king, Eighteenth-Century, to ordain as a monk or be executed, whereupon he was banished to Sri Lanka with that final shipment of VOC brokered monks in 1759. The following year in Sri Lanka, during the summer of 1760, disaffected Kandyan courtiers, resentful of their foreign-born king and his kin's successful consolidation of power, attempted to have him executed in a spectacularly brutal and public way, while listening to one of the newly arrived Siamese monks giving a Buddhist sermon, whereupon the king was to be pushed into a concealed pit of spikes dug in the center of the monastery. The co-conspirators, in the event the rebellion had been successful, it wasn't, selected none other than Krom Muen Thep Phiphit to succeed as the new monarch of Sri Lanka. The Dutch, in the lead up to war and escalating tensions with Kandy, soon became deeply interested in the Siamese monastic prince, whom they subsequently, let's see, I lost my spot. There we go. Subsequently and reluctantly deported back to Siam by order of the Kandyan king, who then used this assassination attempt against him as justification to amass a large military force. As Kandy and the company headed toward outright war in 1761, its Colombo-based governors became quite excited, frankly, about the possibility that they might be able to locate and install Thep Phiphit themselves as a loyal puppet king, given that he had earlier been tapped as a replacement by the Kandyan co-conspirators. Subsequent to his exile from the island and his return to Ligor near present-day Nakhon Si Thammarat, VOC governors Jan Schreuder and later Lubbert Jan van Eyck organized 2 unsuccessful missions to the Gulf of Siam in 1762 and again in 1764, each time hoping to locate the ambitious monastic prince and aspiring to depose King Kīrti Śrī Rājasiṃha themselves, where the earlier co-conspirators had failed. The company, in other words, hoped to install this monastic prince, believing that ordinary Kandyans would deem him an acceptable, even desirable replacement. And as Anne suggests, we'll see why soon. These efforts were first aided, but then led totally astray by the advice and the interventions of a second peculiar character, a Portuguese Catholic priest named Fre Manuel de St. Joachim. He had been a missionary and a vicar for the Portuguese community in Ayutthaya for how long, I'm not quite sure, and arrived at the Dutch fort in Cochin in southern India in the spring of 1764, confessing that his proximity to Dutch officials at the VOC's Siamese factory over the years had led him to embrace their Protestant Calvinism as the true faith. More provocatively than that even, he claimed to have extensive knowledge about Thep Phiphit's whereabouts and sort of talked extensively about the reasons for the failure of the 1762 mission, as I soon will also talk extensively about. He claimed to have access to the Siamese officials currently guarding the monk prince, and we'll learn that with the benefit of historical hindsight, I think his diagnosis for the failure of the 1762 mission was pretty plausible. But I'll argue that it was in part because of his involvement in the 1764 mission that it too failed. My presentation today then brings together Dutch VOC colonial surveillance and political resolutions from Kandy, Ayutthaya, and Batavia, as well as segments, little bits from the Pongsawadang Kīrti Śrī Rājasiṃha, the Ayutthaya Chronicles, to bear on the aftermath of Buddhist monastic relations that had earlier obtained but are now in the midst of disintegrating between two kingdoms separated by the Bay of Bengal and the Dutch colonial merchants who brought them together in a temporary and tendentious, even dangerous moment of religious diplomacy. Okay, so with this impossibly brief sketch of like the first 4 chapters of my dissertation out of the way, we now arrive in the final chapter, what I really want to talk about today, which begins then with the aftermath of that failed assassination attempt against the Kandyan king. I want to think about how these earlier projects of religious diplomacy give way to violence, disintegration, and regime change, not necessarily in the hands of governors, armies, kings, and courtiers, but by such unlikely characters as a power-hungry Siamese monastic prince and a recalcitrant Portuguese priest. So I'll start then by following Thep Phiphit's meandering journey back to Siam in 1761 in the hands of the VOC, and in the context of the war and their attempts to overthrow the Kandyan Kingdom. And then we'll examine the company's failed first mission to Siam to track him down in 1762. And this is where Fre Manuel enters our story. Suddenly appearing at the VOC fort in southern India, claiming to have converted to Dutch Reformed Protestantism, representing himself as the ideal candidate to lead a second mission. We'll end then, and we'll look at how that mission falls apart too, and end with the fall of Ayutthaya in 1767. And these two figures, the Portuguese priest and the Siamese prince, are not directly, causally related to the acute events leading to the fall of the Ayutthaya kingdom. I think they help us understand something about how religious and political power were configured, made visible, and remediated. Not as historical actors who represented these eminently more powerful institutions like European company states, indigenous kingdoms, and their religious sanghas, but precisely because of their propensity to work through and across and in between and in defiance of these institutions for their own gain, or so they hoped. All right, so despite the company's extensive efforts and the expenses that it incurred to patronize Buddhist monastic connectivity between Kandy and Ayutthaya in the 1740s and 1750s, relations between Kandy and the VOC had deteriorated to such an extent that they were headed to war. Governor Jan Schreuder had instituted aggressive cultivation policies for coconut and cinnamon, and the assassination plot too had weakened King Kīrti Śrī Rājasiṃha's influence, something the company hoped to exacerbate. With low country and coastal belt plantation laborers increasingly feeling the squeeze, and the king's desire to shore up public perceptions of his grandeur and his might, In light of the rebellion, the potential for violent confrontation was imminent. Bands of coastal-dwelling Sinhalese fled into the upland recesses of the kingdom, complaining about the company's tough cinnamon-peeling quotas and violent enforcement of continued labor, and the king began to contemplate an offensive. Just as this was taking place, company spies began hearing whispers about the disaffection amongst his subjects just after the assassination attempt, who, they learned, desired Thep Phiphit on their throne. The monk prince, reluctantly removed from the island by the company, eventually returned to the southern peninsula of the Ayutthayan Empire, the Malay Peninsula, near Nakhon Thammarat, where he was immediately placed under guard, just as attacks from Burmese Konbuang militias threatened to destroy Mergui and Tenasserim, but not for a lengthy stay with the VOC in India. In Siamese and Kandyan sources, we learn very little about Thep Phiphit's subsequent itinerary after his deportation from the island for his involvement in the plot against the Kandyan king. The Ayutthaya chronicles simply remark that he fled forth from the island of Lanka, boarding and traveling on a keg sloop, and he came to disembark and live at a Thet municipality, presumably India. In VOC sources, however, we learn much more about his onward journey. Departing the island with the Dutch, he's subsequently brought by the company to Tuticorin in southern India, where Governor Schreuder exchanges letters with him via the company's agents there. So for example, on March 10th in 1761, Godfried Zweep, the VOC's chief at Tuticorin, writes to Schreuder to relay that I had the Siamese prince Tamaban, which was his monastic name, compose and sign through his interpreters a letter for the governor, something he did with great willingness, not showing it to anyone except for his entourage. And Sveep seems to suggest that through his interactions with Thep Phiphit, he was able to clearly determine that him and his domestics were very bitter toward the Kandyan king. This aroused Schreuder's interest, and he wanted to know more. So he directs Sveep to put a long list of questions to Thep Phiphit and his attendants, and I'll just read a couple of them. What are the intentions that the king of Kandy has with regard to the Dutch company? Those intentions are evil, and because of this, His Majesty summoned all of his court nobles with some of the Kandyan monks, some of the Siamese priests, in order to declare intention to enter into war against the company, in spite of both parties cautioning him against this. I'm gonna maybe skip this one because I've got just so much to show you. Does the prince still have credit amongst ordinary Kandyans? He does, but his biggest supporters were executed by the Kandyan king, presumably for their involvement in the rebellion. How then might the company sow disagreement amongst the king's courtiers to win them over to the company? We don't really know how to accomplish this. Even the company's subjects on the island, to say nothing of the king's, complain of poor treatment. An atmosphere of mistrust abounds. It was a difficult environment indeed, Thep Phiphit and his domestics seem to suggest, in which to galvanize support against the king and for the company. Schreuder, nevertheless, was determined to try, but it would take another year before anything came of this. His designs to use Thep Phiphit to exacerbate conflict on the island, to drive a wedge between coastal and Kandyan Sinhalese populations otherwise loyal to the king, seemed a remote possibility in early 1761, but once Thep Phiphit returned to Siam the year later, Schreuder himself then would turn to this power-hungry monk prince, seemingly eager to collude with the company as a potential puppet king. As a result, I think the case of Thep Phiphit and the Dutch give historians a really exceptional and disturbing and perhaps unprecedented example of the Dutch company's attempts at novel forms of political experimentation and exploitation in an Indian Ocean marked by regime change and war. Thep Phiphit returns to Siam as it, like Kandy, is in the midst of violent conflict. In the late 1750s, the Burmese Konbuang king Ayutthaya consolidates his hold over a number of kingdoms throughout the Irrawaddy River basin, Newly enriched with trade from India, he begins to overrun small Ayutthayan settlements in Martaban, Tavoy, and Tenasserim. Centuries-old rivalries between Siamese and Burmese are rekindled. In January 1760, Mergui is taken by Alongpaya's troops, followed by Tenasserim. The southern route to Ayutthaya lay open. By early April, Burmese forces were mere miles from the capital, ransacking and razing villages and settlements along the way. And they soon bore down on the city. In the fighting, the small Dutch lodge just on the other side of the Chao Phraya River, right next to the Ayutthaya railway station, if you've ever been there, was ransacked, as were many other foreign trading posts. Soon, however, a preponderance of the Burmese troops fell ill and withdrew when Alongpaya also fell ill and passed away suddenly. The offensive and the sudden chaos of their withdrawal left the city and the kingdom clinging to life. In Tuticorin, meanwhile, Thep Phiphit soon learned there was trouble at home, and the Ayutthaya chronicles relay that he boarded and traveled again on a ship of a keg factor of the Thep municipality, entering at the municipality of Marit. The government there reports this to the Ayutthayan king, Ekatat, who thereupon issues a proclamation to have him brought in and detained. So in Siam, Thep Phiphit is met with King Ekatat's suspicion and fear, not only because the monk prince's involvement in the earlier 1758 succession dispute that the kingdom fought against their brother, but especially by virtue of the king's critically weakened position in the wake of the Burmese siege. So King Ekatat, intent on suffering no further interpolation against his sovereignty, wasted little time in having his troublesome younger half-brother placed under guard. As a result, the company's desire to remain in contact with him in hopes of returning him to the island was met with a significant challenge its envoys will soon struggle to overcome. So on February 18th, in 1762, Governor van Eck succeeds Schreuder as the governor of Ceylon in southern India, based in Colombo. Van Eck continues Schreuder's policy of aggressive cinnamon cultivation quotas, and the violence with Kandy continues to escalate. In the midst, he revisits this possibility of obtaining Thep Phiphit in Siam, a project that will consume his imagination for the next 3 years. Not only was the war with Kandy intensifying, there's another threat on the horizon. Rumors of English warships spotted off the coast of the island soon reached Colombo. In fact, the Kandyan king, Kīrti Śrī Rājasiṃha, had contacted the British East India Company's council in Madras, who sent one of their agents to Kandy to hold a series of talks with the king. And he left a really detailed travelogue and report of his interactions with the Kandyan court, which, oddly enough, there's a copy of in the University of Wisconsin River Falls archive. Really, really cool. I'm not sure how it got there. From those materials, it's clear that the king was dead set on a full-scale mutual campaign against their shared enemy, the VOC. At the end of 1762, Van Eck seriously considers launching a mission to locate Thep Phiphit and return him to the island. Like the earlier missions, about which I'm not otherwise talking about at all, in friendlier times to bring monks from Ayutthaya, there was a lengthy period of deliberation and decision-making before the voyage was approved and dispatched. At Van Eck's behest, a cursory information-gathering embassy was dispatched to Ayutthaya directly from India in June 1762, but it met no success, a portent of things to come. Van Eck's desire to see Thep Phiphit replace King Kīrti Śrī as a puppet gathered significant steam upon receiving gathered surveillance from company spies. And so in an unsigned letter from May 1762, addressed to a company-employed headman, an anonymous informant declares that the Kandyan king will not settle these disturbances in any way. His Majesty has openly said, in the presence of many greater and lesser courtiers of various political subdivisions of Kandy, that so long as the sun and moon stand in the firmament of heaven, his territories would not be ceded to the Dutch, nor come under their subordination. Yet, if the honorable company, the aide de la compagnie, was so willing, the Siamese prince, descendant from the sun, sincerely devoted to the Buddha's teachings, who had been sent away from the island, and for whom the principal members of the Kandyan court held great affection and attachment, should be brought back here to be placed on the throne. And if the company was so willing, the nephew of basically the chief courtier and ringleader of the assassination attempt, his nephew should, with two other people disguised as envoys, be sent to Siam to entice him. Thus, everything would be restored to peace and tranquility. That nephew, they conclude, is a wise and noble man and no good friend of His Majesty. The anonymous letter reveals that before he had been exiled from the island for his part in the plot and for his aspiration to replace the Kandyan king, Thep Phiphit had befriended one Tibatuvave Buddharakita, the nephew of the chief courtier who fomented the rebellion. Furthermore, this wise and noble nephew was geen good friend van zijn majesteit, no good friend of His Majesty's, the informant claimed, harboring a deep resentment for the king for having his uncle executed, one the company hoped could be used to entice Thep Phiphit back to the island. The VOC's political council considered this surveillance together with the British threat at great length, and the company was somewhat dubious about these big claims made in the report, especially about the willingness of the prince to be enthroned in Kandy and the willingness of influential courtiers there to accept him, owing to his Buddhist piety. But they soon resolved to put a plan in motion, writing to the High Political Council in Batavia for approval and funding. On August 6th, the Governor General, Petrus Albertus Vandapara, and the High Council in Batavia wrote to Van Eck in Colombo approving the plan to search for Thep Phiphit in Siam after a rather lengthy period of deliberation. Would another expensive and risky mission to Siam, this time not to help the king, but to dethrone him, pay the hoped-for dividends? What was the likelihood of success? Would the monk prince restore peace and quiet? After discussing these questions, Vandapara and the councilors concluded that because the Sinhalese would willingly sacrifice themselves for the preservation of the Buddhist the Buddhist doctrine, we have decided to dispatch an embassy to Siam, ostensibly, to get some rice and other commodities that we need. But really, our aim is to invite the prince with his entourage to grant him all royal dignity by virtue of our strong cooperation with those good Kandyan officials, i.e. the ones who are against the king, and to place him on the throne. Thus, we've provided and qualified the envoys to give him whatever gifts and to placate him and make him happy. One of those moments when I found this in the archive, my jaw was just like on the floor. The tone of the approval resolution suggests a strong assumption that it would succeed, despite some of the councilors' misgivings. But I think there's something else happening here as well. The VOC is playing off of the fact that the Kandyan king is quote unquote no lover of the Buddhist doctrine. And there's a reason. One that I've largely sort of held off on unpacking because I've given you too many contexts and things to think with already. But to the extent you'll permit me, just one more. The reason the Kandyan king's own courtiers and monks attempted to assassinate him in 1760 was because of his foreign-derived extraction. His immediate royal predecessors and family members had come from southern India, spoke Telugu and Tamil by birth, and practiced Shaiva religious rituals we might now associate with Hinduism. In brief, then, he was viewed as a threat to the stability and patronage of Buddhist monastic institutions on which public perceptions of suitability for rule in part rested. These motivations have been and still are really hotly debated by historians. So if you want to learn more about that, we can talk about it in the Q&A, or I've got a whole other dissertation chapter you can read. Amidst these hopes and plans for how to sow political division leading to support for Thep Phiphit, or one of his sons or another royal designated by the Ayutthayan court, is this sort of unstated assumption that it would succeed. And I know Catherine, who I don't think is here today, was fascinated by the fact that he had 2 or perhaps 3 sons. And I'm sorry to say I don't know anything more about in what circumstances or when he had children. Okay, so let's see. The council then selects a guy named Martin Huisvorn to lead the mission. He's a 33-year career servant of the VOC who had most recently overseen the factory in Nagasaki. He's given explicit approval to bring back Thep Phiphit or one of his sons or another royal designated by the Ayutthayan court. Huisvorn departs from Batavia in September, sails directly to the Gulf of Siam, where he begins submitting throughout the month of October and November numerous requests to speak with none other than King Ayutthaya. This was suspicious. The sudden arrival of 3 rather than the usual 1 Dutch ships was really unusual. Normally they just sent 1. And a rumor was soon spread that they were there to liberate Thep Phiphit. I don't know if it's a rumor, if it's true. They arrived as Ayutthaya was still in disarray in the wake of the Burmese siege. Huisvorn permits Siamese forces to conduct a full inspection of all 3 of his craft as they sail north up the Chao Phraya River, and this was in defiance of their treaty and longstanding diplomatic practice, I think an attempt to communicate transparency. But the Siamese remain suspicious and fearful, especially as Huisvorn and the others refused to declare what their purpose for suddenly arriving was. Time and time again, he is rebuffed by the Praklang, the Ayutthayan foreign minister, who basically just says, you're never going to be able to speak with the king directly, characterizing their request as a significant breach in protocol. In response, Huisvorn counters that their presence in the capital is due to a desire to express the VOC's friendship to the king directly. The Praklang remains intractable and refuses to grant access to the reclusive King Ayutthaya. On October 17th, for example, Huisvorn notes in his subsequent report for the government in Batavia that the Praklang had asked him whether the Batavia Council instructed him to speak to none other than the king, and furthermore, on what basis he had the right to do so, reiterating that this request is not how things are done in Ayutthaya. Finally, on October 26th, he arranges to meet with the Praklang face-to-face, who permits them to enter the city in order to gather provisions. But when the appointed time comes for their meeting, they're greeted instead by a low-ranking official, a tacit but unequivocal message that their dealings had reached a standstill. On November 10th, they leave Ayutthaya empty-handed. Huisvorn then prepares a lengthy report for the government in Ayutthaya and lists several reasons for the failure of their mission. The Dutch had offended the court with their insistence on speaking to none other than the king, but mostly they blame the Praklang himself, who poisoned the opinion of the king and court against them and was, quote, far less amenable to Dutch interests than the old one, who they liked better. All right, I'm gonna sort of skip ahead a little bit because there's just a lot here happening. The war is still raging in Kandy 2 years later. On February 3rd, 1764, Governor von Eck, together with another junior merchant who would later become governor himself, embark on an expedition to the interior of the island, hoping to gain first-hand intelligence about Kandy's military activities against the company. Within days, they learned that a recently exiled Javanese prince, who arrived on the island as a volunteer backup infantryman in the company's offensive, is mistaken by many Kandyans to be none other than Thep Phiphit. For von Eck, this signaled 2 things. First, knowledge of the 1762 mission to track down the monastic prince must have leaked out. And second, because of this, rumors were once again circulating that the VOC was at work to install him on the throne. With the events of the failed 1762 mission to obtain Thep Phiphit apparently common knowledge throughout Kandy, and an active rumor circulating, again, is it true if it's a rumor, is it a rumor if it's true, but nevertheless, word is circulating that the company had already brought the monk prince back to Kandy, and so Van Eck turned his attention to another mission to do that which he was already suspected of. Now enters our Portuguese priest. 2 months later, in May 1764, a rather unexpected source of inspiration prompts the governor to act. Fre Manuel de St turns up at the port of Cochin in southern India. The priest who had served the church for I'm not sure how long, generally several years in the sources, claims that his many interactions with VOC agents over the years had led him to adopt their Reformed Calvinist faith. And in 1760, he makes plans to go to Batavia in order to formally convert. This, however, is discovered by the presiding bishop, a Frenchman, and Fre Manuel is imprisoned and is only able to escape to a VOC comptoir at the end of 1763 when he's smuggled out of the kingdom via Malacca. Soon in southern India, he recounts the events of the failed 1762 mission to the chief of the fort in Cochin, who then writes to Van Eck in Colombo. And within weeks, Fre Manuel is brought to the island, where he meets with the governor personally. Van Eck then has Fre Manuel prepare a sworn attestation in Latin, which is translated into Dutch by interpreters, and in it he narrates in great detail not only the succession dispute between Ayutthaya's kings Krom Muen and Thep Phiphit in the wake of Boromakot's death, but also he narrates the story of Thep Phiphit's exile to Lanka, his subsequent return to Siam, and the reasons for the failure of the 1762 mission, giving his enthusiastic assurances about the present whereabouts of the monk prince and of his active desire to return to Lanka. Concerning the reasons for the failure of the 1762 mission, he writes that the envoys had been able to gain no audience with the Ayutthayan king because of the Roman bishop of the French, who persuaded His Majesty that they were not ambassadors, but spies who had come to wrest the empire away from the Siamese king, not the Kandyan one, and surrender it to the prince. Thus, they were forced to depart. In fact, nothing had so reinforced the king's suspicion aroused by the French bishop that the Dutch sought to bring the prince to the Siamese throne as the affections the prince had shown over and over again to the Dutch. Fre Manuel suggests that the French bishop in Ayutthaya had led the court to believe the company's secret ambassadors were spies seeking to install Thep Phiphit on the Ayutthayan, not the Kandyan throne. And I think given their refusal to disclose to the Paklang anything about their ambitions, it's not altogether implausible that King Thep Phiphit and the court believed that Houseforn and the others were there to install him on their throne. It's sort of a mystery, but I think that this is a possibility we should consider. Furthermore, Fre Manuel's claims about the French bishop, I think we should also take this with a lot of circumspection. His claims about the French bishop were no doubt also motivated by their previous history together. Remember, it was the same French bishop who had him imprisoned once his desire to convert to Protestantism came to light. Yet in the attestation, Fre Manuel claims that he knows exactly where Thep Phiphit is, and that Fre Manuel was close to Thep Phiphit, his sons, and their half-brother, King Krom, and would have a better chance of success than anyone else. 4 days later, on May 18th, he prepares a subsequent report for the governor, claiming that the prince's servants who had gone to Ayutthaya ahead of him informed me that their master promised that if the company helped him conquer the empire of Kandy, he would dedicate its sovereignty to them. Governor Van Eck, armed with an informant and a fixer for his dealings in Ayutthaya, prepares another secret mission in 1764. And this time, its intent and its details are kept secret even from other members of the council, lest it falls apart due to rumor and communicative missteps. He appoints someone named Willem van Damast Limburger, a junior merchant, to lead the expedition alongside Fre Manuel. Van Eck then writes 3 letters, one to Van Damast Limburger, one to the ship captain, and one to none other than Thep Phiphit. To Van Damast Limburger, he basically says that you need to hide the real purpose of this mission for as long as possible. Not even the captain knows what the purpose is until they were well out at sea and free of the island, and they were to sail directly to Mergui, and to claim that their sudden arrival there was due to adverse winds, navigational errors, and the need to pick up supplies. To Thep Phiphit, to the monk prince, the governor reiterated the desire of the Kandyan nobles and monks to see him as their king, trying to reassure him that he had the company's full backing in this endeavor. He writes about the great affection of the nobles of the Kandyan court, their desire to see Your Highness on the throne, something that caused the high government in Batavia to send a mission to Siam. Yet he sort of demurs or elides the reason for the failure, saying merely, it didn't please His Majesty the Siamese king to grant us an embassy, an audience. Thus, I've decided to invite you again with the promise that not only shall we receive you with royal honors, but you shall be supported with all our might to ascend the throne of Kandy as king. And since Professor Hansen mentioned that a big part of my project is about friendship and how friendship and danger work together, he ends, I pray to the Most High God that He may bless Your Highness with health, bring you to us without difficulty, so that you, united in friendship with the mighty Dutch company, may ascend the throne of Kandy. They depart in July, unbeknownst to other members of the political council in Ceylon, and even before receiving the resolution from the Governor General approving their petition. And this was a risk, but it wasn't a large one. Jan Schreuder, the previous governor who had earlier worked to bring Thep Phiphit to the island, now served on the council in Batavia, and so the proposal was likely to be approved. And it was. The approval came on November 26th, when the mission had already been underway for several months. 2 days later, on November 28th, the council also decreed that should the prince accept our invitation, we, by his elevation to the throne, would be in a much more advantageous position than we could ever get continuing to try and push for a treaty. This will come back, this will become important. All right, so they approach Mergui in September. Fre Manuel goes aboard and makes all of these pretexts, the advised pretexts for their sudden arrival. Oh, the wind has carried us off course, and begins making inquiries about Thep Phiphit while distributing VOC gifts to his network of informants. From Van Damas Limburger's later report, which is what I'm drawing on here, we learned that Fre Manuel relays to the Dutch that Thep Phiphit is in fact no longer in Mergui, but in Tenasserim, where he's being held under guard. So he exchanges a series of letters to the viceroy in Tenasserim, to the monk prince himself, attempts to reach his sons as well while stalling for time. And it seems one of the sons writes back to him. So he writes back and he sends a whole bunch of gifts. And the son says that he wants to come down and meet with the Dutchmen and the Portuguese, but he won't until he gets his father's permission. And this is delayed for several weeks by a series of holidays and festivals. Van Damas Limburger becomes increasingly restless, and he starts to sense trouble. Quite by accident, he in fact discovers the Tenasserim-based viceroy who was on a short trip, unbeknownst to him, to whom he does finally reveal what it is exactly they're there to do. The viceroy promises to send letters north to Ayutthaya, to King Ayutthaya directly, and suggests that he continues to write to Ayutthaya and refer the matter to the Ayutthayan court directly. But the viceroy also states that he had known Fre Manuel for many years, and upon his sudden arrival, he had him followed by 4 of his men, believing the Catholic missionary to be a scoundrel with a reputation for frequenting establishments known for drinking and sex work, something quite, unusual for a Catholic priest, right? And felt that this whole thing was not going to succeed. So he then writes directly to King Ayutthaya, saying, the Kandyan king has disgraced himself. It would be good if, and here I'm just giving you a flavor of how they refer to him in the Dutch, Prince Krom Muen Thep Phiphit were to be released, or one of his sons, or another member of the family inclined to sit on the throne. But Van Damas Limburger had other reasons to suspect the intentions of Fre Manuel. He meets with an Armenian merchant who he plies with gifts, who replies that there's no way that this guy has been in touch with Thep Phiphit. He's been under guard, he's been like locked away, he would certainly not be in a position where he was exchanging letters, and like all of this is fake. No sooner than sending this letter to King Ekathat's court on November 15th, von Damas-Limburger in fact spots Fre Manuel in the street and reports that he was dressed in the habit of a Dominican monk and was accompanied by several Portuguese, and this seemed to him to be the kind of final realization that this was leading nowhere. And he held little, if any, sincerity in his claims of affection for the Dutchmen and their religion. And in his report, he had some very choice words about von Damas-Limburger. And I realize it's one, so we need to get out of here. Thanks so much for coming. And I promise I'm tilting toward the close. He calling him a cursed villain and vervloekte boosheid and an unscrupulous scoundrel. Time had run out. Sinbushin, the son of the deceased Burmese king Ayutthaya, was advancing on the Siamese kingdom again. And toward the end of 1764, two forces are dispatched, one bearing down from the north on Chiang Mai and another from the south on Mergui and Tenasserim. And by January, both cities had fallen to the Konbuang armies. In his report, von Damas-Limburger relays that we were made to flee due to a sudden and dangerous event, and so they depart. There's all kinds of conversation about a third attempt, and I think it's really fascinating, and I've got a whole page of notes to talk about, but I'm gonna just spare us and move on to the end. No longer would Dutch ships sail between Lanka and Siam, nor do we encounter Fre Manuel again in the Dutch, Siamese, or Lankan archives. The fate of Thep Phiphit, however, is, I think, somewhat more clear. According to the Ayutthaya chronicles, he amassed a following, a sizable following, in what are now Prachinburi and Rayong, where he leads an army in several clashes with the Burmese. The kingdom of Ayutthaya, as many of you know, would not last. Chris Baker and Pasuk Pongpachit devote an extensive discussion to the fall of Ayutthaya in their comprehensive history of the kingdom. And they argue that previous generations of Thai nationalist history writing, rooted, for instance, in Prince Damrong Rajanupap's Thai Rop Pama, have tended to characterize the fall of the city and the kingdom to Burmese Konbuang emperors as the culmination of a continuous campaign of Burmese aggression, rather, they suggest, than a conflict contained to just two early modern periods, the second half of the 16th century and the middle of the 18th. With strengthened defenses, monsoon canals, and reinforced walls around the city, together with the ability to raise a large army quickly, the kingdom did not, they suggest, feel at risk. By the end, however, of 1766, when the rainy season had eased, Sinbushin's forces approached the city and blockaded river and road crossings while destroying crops to cut off the food supply. In their desperation, farmers and other laborers banded together and posed a secondary threat as roving thieves. By the spring of 1767, the city is surrounded. Burmese forces push in from the northeast. It falls on April 7th. King Ekathat is either captured and executed, or he dies while attempting to flee. His brother Utompon, in the robes of a monk, is taken to Ava, along with many other captives. Burmese soldiers soon start fires around the city, which converge into a giant uproar of flames. Ultimately, according to Baker and Pongpachit, and if there are other people I need to be reading on the fall of Ayutthaya, I'm curious as I continue to think about how to tell this story better and adapt it into a book. Baker and Pongpachit argue that Ayutthaya's cultural distance from the forms of martial law and military supremacy that had governed earlier eras gave way to an increasingly wealthy and militaristically disengaged elite. The fall of the city, Pasuk and Chris summarize, was, quote, not due so much to internal conflict or dynastic decline, but a failure to manage the social and political consequences of prosperity. Soon after the fall, a new Siamese emperor, Taksin, begins to consolidate the forces not captured and taken to Burma into a loose federation centered on Thonburi. Amongst the fray is Thep Phiphit, who had previously amassed a sizable contingent of followers in the war and self-designated a suzerainty over the Korat region. He runs afoul of Thaksin, as he had so many other monarchs before, probably because he attempts to coronate himself, not once, but twice. And in 1770, Thaksin has him executed. All right, to bring this to a close, the VOC's missions to track down Thep Phiphit were never successful. Not only because a rumor had spread at the militarily exhausted Ayutthayan court in 1762 that the Dutch were there to depose their king and not Kandy's, but later in 1764 and 5, because Fre Manuel had misrepresented not only his ability to gain an audience with Siamese nobles, but especially the very foundations on which the Dutch had trusted him with this secretive and important endeavor. As a prelude to, and of course, once this came to light, with the threat of violence looming, there was no choice but to flee. As a prelude to war in both Kandy and Ayutthaya, the assassination plot against Kandy's King Kīrti Śrī Rājasiṃha and the VOC's sustained efforts to use it to their advantage, with a remarkable experiment in political exploitation, reveals the kinds of disintegration and danger that are the potential outcomes of even the most initially amicable projects of religious diplomacy. And so my larger dissertation ultimately engages or examines how friendship and danger are co-constitutive elements of early modern Indian Ocean connectivity and its disintegration. For an extractive imperial company state like the VOC, who physically and logistically mediated the earlier restoration of a declining Buddhist monastic lineage by bringing in Ayutthayan monks, I don't think this exploitation should come as a surprise. But as I've tried to show, the fault lines of dangerous and violent disintegration amongst formerly amicable friends were cracked open not principally or most acutely by governors and infantrymen, but by these unlikely and peripatetic characters like a Siamese prince and a Portuguese priest, wandering between worlds to which they did not entirely belong, each of them with complex and fraught and shifting personal and institutional entanglements and loyalties. As historians like me continue to write connected historical narratives about seafaring Indian Ocean people in the wake of Sanjay Subramaniam and Sebastian Conrad, I think stories like this one remind us that connectivity was driven by relations of power and largely made possible by powerful institutions like the VOC, Buddhist kingdoms, and their religious sanghas. Yet, by focusing on the power relations from the perspective of ambitious and charismatic wanderers who moved through and between and across and in defiance of these institutions, I want to try to make the argument that we should conceive of disconnection, danger, violence as part of what early modern connectivity means and what it makes possible. Dynamics so often affected by folks who called one another friend, but whose friendships were wielded to gain and retain power at one another's expense. All right, thank you so much. I'm excited to hear your questions. What didn't add up? What you want to hear more about?